So the pages of early Soviet performance, this is the project, but I'll talk more about it in a broader and then more micro sense, of course. So this project, which began at Princeton University, is ever evolving, but began its life, as you see, as the pages of early Soviet performance. And it began where so many DH projects begin, with the digitization of a large body of rare and fragile materials. In this case, we have a corpus of early Soviet illustrated periodicals, largely dedicated to performing arts, but they're not exclusively so, and I'll talk about that as well. I'm going to be speaking today in various forms of we to represent the project, but our working group is a collaboration between multiple technical leads. At Princeton, we actually have Andrew Django, who's not at Princeton, but at Haverford College, but supported a lot of the project. Since I have been at Stanford, I've been working closely with Quinn Dombrowski. Project directors include myself, as well as Thomas Keenan, the Slavic librarian at Princeton, and Natasha Yermolayev, the associate director at the Princeton Center for Digital Humanities. We have also collaborated with colleagues and students from ITMO, that's the Information Technology, Optical Design and Engineering University in St. Petersburg, Russia, in the earliest stages of our project. I would also be happy to talk about the institutional collaborations in more detail in our discussion, as I believe that this is a significant site of real potential for digital humanities, and especially for a small field like Slavic studies. How do we raise visibility? I think we can do that through digital humanities. Now, periodicals themselves represent a diverse and complex genre. In the journals which make up our current corpus, and I use corpus pretty lightly, it's a collection, they are published between 1922 and 1936, and in them we see over 100,000 articles, poems, editorial commentaries, advertisements, theater listings, as well as images appearing on the printed page in a variety of genres and media. And this is a tumultuous time in which the genre and expectations of Soviet periodicals were still being debated. This post-revolutionary moment, so after 1917, and once printing began again after the Russian Civil War, after 1922, was characterized by experimentation as new editors sought to gain foothold not only with a new Soviet reading public, but also in the very definition of what would become Soviet art. And this is achieved, of course, in the subjects covered, as well as the ways in which they are presented in the journals. I'm just showing you here, this is just a smattering of 4 very different journals from our collection, related some to the performing arts, some not, but you can even see if you're just reading the typefaces, even without the typography, even without knowing Russian, you can see how differently these journals are positioning themselves in this landscape. And then just a quick look at the insides as well. So this is always a question too of form and content. So given the complexities of the journal's graphic environment, extracting data from the source material presents but a first stage challenge. How can we teach a machine to accurately segment documents into content types specific to these journals, images versus text, titles versus text blocks, such that researchers, ideal or otherwise, might retrieve and utilize useful data? Our process seeks to highlight the informative patterns that might be obscured in the simple process of manual or habitual reading, including issues editorial design to the larger still structures of journal titles as complete entities. And this is informed in our understanding of the journal as a semiotic space that operates under its own laws, which also might at any given moment shift, making and forming reader expectations and experience. Through the abstraction of the constituent elements of these journals as data, the structures and formats of these periodicals, including layouts, the relationship between image and text, typography, and illustration type, we might produce representations that will make not only the journal's contents, but also those structures and formats available to distant reading and analysis for researchers, be they scholars of Soviet periodicals, theater, performance, or media studies more broadly. So let's get a little bit more into this collection as such. Move forward, a sec. Getting stuck, there we go. So the titles at the heart of the project right now are housed and are digitized at the Princeton University Library. And I invite you to, you can click on that first link. That'll take you to the list of the periodicals and their digitization if you want to have another window open too. And here's just a list of them overall. We have some here like Dayosh, which is actually much more of a visual studies journal. I would say that when we look at this from a historical perspective, we're looking at the history of the avant-garde, at constructivism, at photography. Journals like Hermitage, Per Symphans, which is the first symphonic ensemble journal, is much more musically focused. So we have a bit of a variety. And a lot of the reason why, this is a very personal and selfish reason, the reason why we've expanded the collection is because they were there at the library, we could digitize them, so we added them to this diverse collection to expand our small corpus. And I'm going to be speaking to, just to foreground where I'm going, mostly about the image component, because again, that is my main role in our project and its exploration. In total, there are 10 titles that have seen high quality digitization with 526 issues and approximately now 26,000 pages that are available to view in IIIF on Princeton's University Digital Library. Again, go ahead and click through as well. So what do we do now that we have our digitized journal pages? The library platform replicates something like traditional reading or leafing, or what we would expect from a good library interface. We can read them, we can flip through them, or we can look at them in a mosaic pattern. And I don't want to discount this operation of reading. This is essential in the presentation of the material and allowing us access that looks more like reading, traditional reading from front to back. It allows us to leaf, to flip, to go quickly, to go slowly. Much of the impetus, though, for this project was the opportunity for our group, this is a Slavic digital humanities working group spread across multiple institutions, to receive a dataset curation grant from Princeton Center for Digital Humanities. And this takes us down the road that we went. For many of us, the ideal aim, those of us working in digital humanities, and the goal ultimately of digitizing these journals or these materials might be to create an interactive database for those journals. Like, for instance, the Blue Mountain Project. And this is the second link that I've dropped into the chat, and I'd invite you there. This is just a screenshot of the search return that is linked in the chat right now. This is a project that I've also been involved in and with, and provides a great model for the life of avant-garde periodicals in digitization. So here we have a sort of network model of many avant-garde journals from the beginning of the 20th century, from across Europe and America, from the Western tradition, and including just one Russian publication, the journal Viesh, or Object, which is a journal that was co-authored and edited by El Lisitsky and Ilya Edinburgh. And as you can flip around here, there's a couple of models that I think have been important for informing the way in which we have approached journals in their digital life. So for instance, here I've done a quick search for Tatlin. So looking for an artist I know will appear in this journal that will appear next to an illustration. And what you can actually see is that it's going to find the text. It's found Tatlin in the text. And then it also tells us, and it's been a little bit cut off here, but it is in an article. So it has provided a typology of the kinds of contents that we would find in a journal. If we then also go to this next slide, I did another just quick search today for the word Soviet, curious about this metadata search or just a search term to see where it might appear. And here you can see the number of issues that it appears in and the number of times the word Soviet appears across this collection of journals. So on the left, you have the Mask, the Broom, La Cité, Viesh, and the number of times in which Soviet appears. The other wonderful part of this, though, and this is just thinking about the organization and presentation of a journal as opposed to other media, is that it also gives us the category of content. So we can see that Soviet was returned in a couple of text contents, that's 20 times in text content, but also in ads. So it has separated out for us in our search return where Soviet as a term might have appeared in what has been categorized in the typology of journals as an advertisement. And then we can look at it diachronically. We can look at when and how frequently, in this case, mostly in 1922, which makes sense because Viesh is well represented here. And it's a Soviet journal that's also hitting quite a bit. Although we only have one return there, it's in dialogue with these others. We can find ways to explain our data here. But this is all to say this could be one model, and it's a really informative one for us moving into how we might deal with our large collection of Soviet avant-garde periodicals, one that treats journals as journals and enhances their digitized life with quantitative analysis. Now, again, our case is a little bit different. With the incentive provided for a dataset curation grant alone, we focus solely on the transformation of these journals into a dataset, allowing, we think, for the exploration of different questions without the end goal being a fully developed interactive database. And this is not one that we've completely dismissed, but it's not currently the end goal of the project. So how do we turn periodicals into data? Our next essential step was the articulation of the categories of information on the journal's pages. Our group settled on 4 preliminary categories, which is under much discussion in the group, and I hope that we can pull this all apart in our Q&A at the end. We have titles, text blocks, images, and mixed text. Those are the labels that you see in the middle of the slide. For the illustrated periodical, text and image are equally significant categories, each presenting unique nodes of complexity in their manifestation on the page and our secondary identification. The image category was conceived in such a way that it's flexible enough to make the large corpora of images, and specifically our graphic arts artifacts, productively explorable. So we're starting with the notion, with the impetus for maximum flexibility. At this stage, we've not yet refined image typologies, photography, caricature, drawing, portrait, etc. And I'll get into why this might be complicated, but simply coded the model to identify images and image neighborhoods to include captions. And again, this is a great area of complexity for me as a scholar of images. Often when we are creating typologies or using vision AI, subject and image can become conflated. And I'll look at a few examples a little bit later. A portrait could be a photograph or a drawn illustration or a caricature, and not all photographs are portraits, but very often in the typologies that have been created, these will be collapsed, right? It'll just be assumed that it's one or the other, or that portrait comes to take over anything that is a photograph, but a researcher may be interested in photographic material, but it's not captured in the labeling typologies that have been applied in any single space. Text too seems more straightforward. Of course, it is not, but we just divided it only into, at this point, title and text block. However, innovative font choices deployed in this moment in print really do warrant further exploration. And I'll just show you a couple of examples here so you can see these are a few pages. I'll unpack them in just one moment. The innovative font choices do really ask us, I think, to add another layer of analysis, which we have also not yet done. Can we explore what the fonts are, label them, say that there are certain kinds of typographic elements that are being used, and label? And I will say as well, the other area under discussion by my Princeton colleagues now is what to do with the OCR and how to really create a clean data set from our OCR. Currently, it is not a very clean site of our data read, of our machine read. We have used Tesseract and Abby Fine Reader in order to create our OCR text. And now we're just trying to experiment on that side with how we can clean it, how we can create accuracy, and even how we can measure the accuracy of the machine read of our text. Now, the mixed text category was devised as a catch-all that included elements where text and graphic design were combined. And you can see that in this overlay, the green area is what we would call mixed text. It's a problem here. So we have advertisements, text using unusual typography, that text which also incorporates visual elements or other graphic design elements, and also a variety of paratextual elements which are particular to journals as well, like covers and mastheads. So if we were to go here, I think I left that out. But all of these could fall into our mixed text category, our very messy mixed text category. And what I want to also show you as well, what you can't quite tell is that in the labeling, and this is part of our correction software that I'll talk about in just one second, it has labeled what looks like this blue area as an image, but it could also be mixed text. One of the things that we're trying to explore is where we start to cross the threshold into something that is more than an image, where text does become significant, but that an image is still there. And we do want to read it as something that is distinct, that is different, that is unique, but how can we create the right label or train the machine to read it as an exception or as a model within a certain journal or within a certain moment in the production of Soviet journals? The same sort of issue might occur if we're looking at the top. This has been labeled as a title, and it certainly is a title, but the interest, the graphic interest here could push it into mixed text. And one could even start to argue, if we get highly conceptual, about the image base of what is happening with the typographic choices and the design that's occurring here. And this could be the only time that we even see this graphic rendering of technology at the back of technique back there. But we want to actually be able to remark on the fact that this is an exception, or be able to say that maybe this is a part of what of the avant-garde or experimental design decisions that are occurring in the journal in this moment. So back to our workflow. What do we do next? So we've created these categories. How do we apply them? With our scanned materials, we used transfer learning to add new document segmentation, and that's what you're also looking at. New document segmentation labels to a YOLO, you only look once, version 5 computer vision model. We did this with a small set of 100 examples created with an image annotation tool from Make Sense AI. To further improve model performance, we then provided manual feedback to the model by correcting machine errors using an application called Mayakovsky. And if you want to jump into Mayakovsky, it's up there on the screen. This is written by our colleague Andrew Janko, and what you're looking at, these screen grabs that I've pulled in the colorized fields or masks, these are from Mayakovsky, where we attempted to correct the model and tell it that we didn't mean mixed text, we meant that to actually be a title. Now, because my work is largely in the area of images, I want to ask what we can do with the images once they have been identified by our machine learning model. So with the trained YOLO model, we were able to identify images in the corpus of the journal pages and actually create a separate collection of images. And you can click on the link, this is the third link in the chat, to Pixplot. We labeled our files with Google Vision and described by subject, and then they were also described by subject with the Max image caption generator from IBM. The resulting files and metadata can be viewed and researched using this Pixplot from Yale DH Lab, which I just have a screen grab from here. But I would invite you to go in and actually click around. I'm going to do the radical thing and attempt to also get us there. So if we pull this up, I'm going to show us how this works with a quick new screen share and try to pull this up. Can everyone see this loading here? Yes. So we'll enter into Pixplot. We'll talk about this a little bit. So the reason why we have really liked Pixplot is that the organization of the interface allows for diachronic reading as well. We can utilize a date slider to limit our returns, and we can hone in on hotspots of images here within the visualizations. So the files and metadata here allow for visualizations of clusters of images, which are based on the machine reads of contrast, tonal densities, and pixel values. So rather than looking at quantities, that is a model just correctly identifying an image type, say 93% of the time, we can now interpret the model predictions as grouped in Pixplot. So we could say we have this cluster where it's really pulled out, in this case, quite a few images with a lot of dark contrast. And here I'm actually kind of curious. I clicked on this one at random, and I'm not sure what the likeness is here, but it could suggest something different in the way in which these are clustered that we wouldn't have seen when we're just looking at something like the line drawing caricatures, which are clearly part of the hotspot of cluster 1. We can also use Pixplot to further delineate by single journal. So it can allow us to highlight the appearance of these types of images in just one journal or just two journals, which might allow us to ask different kinds of questions as well. This is another really fantastic one where it's pulled out our mixed text category as images as well and clustered those together here. So we, now the human interpreters, can make sense of what the model has learned or failed to learn through this kind of visualization. Portraits, for instance, as you might have just seen, are really easy for the model to learn and to identify. However, recognizing a figure as a portrait in painterly form is actually much more difficult for the machine to read. And I'll show you an example of how that's gone quite wild a few times for us in a moment as well. So I will come back to my more static images, but I do highly recommend clicking around and exploring that as you can at your leisure. Let me return to my screen share of my PowerPoints. The ever elegant moves back and forth. Okay. So the other reason why we've really enjoyed using something like Pixplot is another part of the impetus behind the way in which we've been exploring images here. So images ordered by machine read densities and typologies of likenesses might allow us to go beyond this reductive verbal labeling approach. So what can we learn when we really approach images as images rather than always reducing them to a textual label? But more significantly, we are also engaging with a model of machine learning that is in spirit and practice, and here I'm quoting Andrew Janko, that highlights the value of the interaction between the scholar and machine, rather than what machines can produce. Such an approach remains ever critical and expansive, even as it refines the accuracy of our machine models. Now, I will build on this same spirit of exploration in showing you what we've been working on here at Stanford. This is the next iteration of visual analysis, and I'm working with Quinn Dombrowski in order to articulate the expression of color across this collection of journals. This is one example of the visualization of our model training on a color printed page. What we have done is to train the machine to render colors as RBG values, so red, blue, and green. And this is done by loading an image into Image Color Picker here, imagecolorpicker.com. And here we, with our fallible human eyes, choose the lightest and darkest color values of a particular color as it is printed on the page. Using those color values, and those are the numbers that you actually see here on the right that are provided once we have scrolled over the appropriate node within the image provided to Image Color Picker. We then choose the lightest and darkest values. So again, this is using our trained judgment, which is another whole node of exploration. And I could spend a whole nother 40 minutes discussing what it might mean to train our judgment. And I hope we can ask a little bit about that later. But using these values that we see here, we then are able to process the image using OpenCV and Python color detection to create a mask. The machine in this case having grabbed the pixels that meet the color criteria and rendering all else in black. What I'm showing you here is actually red rather than the blue example from the Image Color Picker here. So if you might be able to tell too, if we were to compare two side by side and looking at the color mask here, so the original image is on the left and then the color mask is there on the right. This is one that is focused mostly on blue, and by mostly I mean entirely on blue, but you might notice that there are many areas that are showing up that may not actually have blue in them, but our color values may have skewed our results to a certain degree. We might also see here that blue is just more difficult for the machine to read in this context. For me, what is actually quite exciting is that I was drawn to places in the image as we were investigating this just the other day and digging quite deeply. I had not noticed at first glance the layering of color and how actually complex the color application is in this image itself by Danieka. So what we have here, if you look quite closely, and you can also make it out in the color mask here on the right, so this horse's rump in the very middle, and the horse's rump here on the left, that we actually, in the creation of the black, the darkest spots or the darkest grays, we often have an application here of the blue printing. So it's another way for us to maybe see something that may not have been available to us in the quick read and flipping through the journal. And then what I hope that we're going to be able to do is start to question our outcomes, and then also ask larger questions about the quantities of colors, maybe across the publication of a single journal or across time. Again, how ubiquitous is a certain color? We know from the history of printing in the Soviet context that, of course, red is going to be ideologically significant, but we also know from our material histories that red is the easiest ink to get a hold of in this moment of ink shortages. So we have a wonderful confluence of material determination and ideological signification. What we'd also like to do with our machine is be able to say, we actually do see this great preponderance of red here, and we see it applied in these quantities across the publication of these journals at a particular moment. Or maybe what could be exciting is that we'll see that it upsets our expectations, and that blue becomes the most significant color at any given moment as things might shift. Again, because we have different kinds of access to inks or materials, different access to papers, and the like. The other thing that I think that we should keep in mind as we are looking at these outcomes and at first glance is that we also need to have in mind the other pieces of the material history, and in this vein, viewing these pages as material historians. That is, that colors are going to fade. Not all red is red, and we are all, and I would assume if we were to start to unpack this image, to look at the red as applied here differently. The more I call it red, the more it looks red, but it's in fact rather orange, which could be the original ink printing. It could be the way in which the color and ink have interacted in their chemical denaturing through time in fading. And we'd like to be able to eventually play with ways to measure this as well. So as we start to move into these last little pieces, I'm going to run towards my end here as well. So this process, I think, highlights the ongoing importance of human choices and interpretation in training our model. But we hope this process will also allow us to gain greater insight. So again, in this case, in the density of certain colors and color applications in the journal through a given time period. And we're continuing to experiment with computer vision and machine learning technologies in combination, as you can see, with some manual categorization and annotation to see whether this can result in a corpus of periodical data being structured in such a way that researchers can explore them productively according to whichever categories of affinity are relevant to their questions. This can be thematic, generic, formal, technical, and stylistic. For that messy mixed text category that I brought up earlier, and we can come back to again for a minute, we need to train the model to recognize and zone these elements with a much greater degree of accuracy. This category, for instance, was not only not clear for the human researchers, it was the least clear of our categories for the machine. That is, in our YOLO predictions, the machine often missed or misidentified the category, or simply was less sure of its own identifications. So in this slide, you can see this on the left, the model identified the entire page as mixed text, but with only a 61% surety of that identification. The machine also misidentified mixed text listings quite often as text blocks. And we can see something like this moment right here. This is mixed text, it's a listing, but this is exactly the same kind of category. So it should have applied the same label to say that that is also mixed text as well, that we had decided that listings for shows should fall within our mixed text category. Because this category, initially conceived to streamline our first stage modeling, was hyperdiverse, it will need to be subdivided into multiple more distinct categories: theatrical listings, advertisements, mastheads, and typographical ornaments. And I'll say here too, as I take a step back, one of the reasons we opened with this maximally flexible idea is that we wanted to embrace this as a total kind of really significant category for journals. But in making it so general, it does sort of lose its ability to really mark something that might be specific or unique or important to the structures. But once we've labeled it, we might also lose something once we have rarefied, once we have codified it as one very particular thing and not another. And I also promised to show one silly misidentified image from our Max image caption generator from IBM. This is one of my favorites here. So this is an image from the journal called 30 dni, or 30 days, and it says it's a black and white photo of a group of stuffed animals. Right? Absolutely. There's a few too where we've had images of Lenin and it says a man riding a skateboard, and I couldn't find that one for today. That's my other absolute favorite one from our misidentification. as well. So not only in this case did it misidentify the subjects, it misidentified the material. And this is another issue for us in printing. We'd say that this is absolutely not photographic, but it is black and white. So it makes sense based on the way in which the image caption generator has been trained. It's been trained on very different kinds of images. We're trying to create a model that would be better at recognizing the kinds of images that are characteristic of Soviet journals as well. And I'd mentioned here too, again, another space of desiderata would be to be able to identify font type. But this is another area where in our group would require another expert in polygraphic history. And in our discussion, I really hope that we can keep expanding the kinds of things we might want to ask. What kinds of questions or what kinds of data would be most interesting or necessary from where you sit in looking at any kind of periodical? So our approach to our material is iterative. Our working group, made up of researchers of visual culture, as well as experts in digital methods and computer learning, identify relevant objects, annotate those objects in the images, train a model, and assess what the model has learned to interpret its results. And while an early aim in the project outcomes would be to publish this data set, we also believe that it could be useful in the documentation of this project to create a practical toolkit to reproduce its workflow such that it might be applied to new collections. This is another kind of laboratory experiment that for me also parallels the kinds of laboratories of experimentation that are characteristics of these journals in their first generation and their printing, trying out new things, seeing what works and seeing what doesn't. Scholars with a wide array of complex graphic materials, not only periodicals, but also poster collections, newspapers, or illustrated books, could segment document images and create new research-focused data sets from images, text, and metadata. We aim to discover the ways in which computational methods can allow us to achieve a macro perspective on the assembly of periodicals. And we are optimistic and enthusiastic about what we might learn about the semiotics of these periodicals' layout, composition, and formatting in the process of teaching machines to recognize these distinct elements and patterns across historical political constructs. I'll go ahead and end there so that we can hopefully have a great discussion.